want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick Wilson and welcome back to the Enemies List. Our guest today is Leah Wright Rigueur, who is the SNF Agra Institute professor at the Johns Hopkins University, and she is a brilliant author and thinker about American politics today. So, well, let me ask you this. Let's start with this, because I like to ask people this because obviously everyone is right now fully obsessed with the campaign as we see it, and I wanted to get your take on where you think the election stands at this moment.
That's a huge question. That's a massive question.
I ask the big questions.
You do ask the big questions. So, I'll take the opportunity to say that there are a couple of things going on with the 2024 election. I think the biggest one is that the American public is deeply frustrated with the fact that we have a matchup between the same people that we saw in 2020, which essentially boils down to the two old white guys. And I think that frustration has been boiling and has been going on for quite some time. Now, there are radical differences between the two old white guys, and we've seen those play out before. It wouldn't be this podcast without me saying, that one of them represents a significant threat to democracy as we understand it.
Absolutely.
Well, the other one is essentially, guarding the rails of democracy and may not be doing it in the way that a lot of people want or aspire to, but that there are still significant differences. I think what's transformed, however, perhaps, are the internal mechanisms of how people understand the ideas of democracy. Right. So I'm going to advance, maybe, throw out an idea here for you, Rick, which is that I don't know that the American public actually is enthusiastic about democracy anymore. I think democracy is a concept that many people in the United States actually have no idea what it means. Because they have no idea what it means, and because they're deeply possessive of ideas surrounding what they believe democracy means or what they believe citizenship means, ultimately, their version of democracy is one that isn't inclusive of the majority of Americans. And so we see this play out largely, I think, in the resurgence of a figure like Donald Trump, who, 3 years ago, if you had asked anybody, Donald Trump was toast. He was done. He was out of here. And yet here we are 4 years later, right back where we were to begin with. So those are a couple of ideas that I'm working with right now. And there's some others I think that are extremely concerning or alarming. But, as we talk about the state of the race, there are a lot of things that I would call slow trickle that ultimately end up mattering a lot for both the state of a democracy, but also the state of the election.
So I had a conversation the other day with a friend of mine who said, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but some of the skepticism about democracy on the part of the MAGA movement, and this is a former Republican also, and he's clearly, he understands the split between this populist nationalist MAGA party and the old GOP that, we came from. And he said to me, he goes, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but, if you don't have to scratch the surface very deeply to understand that a lot of the skepticism of democracy on the right is now racially based, and is now essentially saying black people and brown people coming from other countries are dangerous to us because it's trying to rewrite who we should be as a people, which is a white evangelical Protestant nation. Talk to me a little bit about where you see that. I mean, how deep under the surface do you think that is?
I actually don't think it's under the surface at all. I think it's out and proud. Shout out to Pride Month, because this is a different kind of pride that we're talking about here. But so let me take a step back. I think the idea of democracy in this country is one that I think we've taken for granted a little bit. And we say,
Right.
we are a democratic nation. We fight for democracy at home. We fight for democracy around the world. But one of the things that we kind of sidestep is the fact that democracy is an extremely bloody, it's a violent process. And it's one that
Absolutely.
is constantly remade. It's not static. It's not fixed. It's not a given. It's something you actually constantly have to work at,
Right.
both to ensure that democracy is working for the people and the public, but also that democracy is including and inclusive of the broader ideas of what we understand to be citizenship. So, in my area of work around politics, one of the areas that I've studied that I think you've seen the most vibrant experience of democracy is with civil rights and with race, right? It's constantly, right? The American civil rights movement is essentially a process about expanding American democracy to include Black people. Think the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
100%.
What is different now is that there is a transition. Before, we had a kind of an idea of democracy where there was a growing, I think, resentment, a grievance politics that emerges during the 1960s, late 1970s, mid 1970s, that is about givers and takers, right? People who say, well, I'm a taxpayer and I pay into the system, and all these other people are just taking from the system. But in a lot of ways, that was fringe, or at the very least controlled by leaders in both parties, right? We can think of somebody like George H.W. Bush, if we're talking about the Republican Party, who said, actually, no, right? There's a more expansive understanding of democracy that is not about givers and takers. And so it was kind of those things, and we would see moments where those would inject themselves into American politics or social politics more broadly. What's different is Donald Trump is the first candidate who really comes forward and actually says, no, I don't believe in democracy for everyone. I believe in democracy for people that look like me. I hear you. I am listening. I believe in what you are saying. And I think that's important because a lot of these kind of larger grievance politics are rooted in ideas of people feeling like they have been left behind, that they have been surpassed, that there is one small pie, and that as we expand the democratic project to be more inclusive of people, that they are losing their share of the pie. And that is wholly rooted, right? It is very easy to root that in a kind of racial politics that says these brown people, these Black people, these yellow people are coming and they are taking what belongs to me. They are not paying their fair share. They are taking from my hard work, my hard work. We don't, and I think that the difference is that we used to have a set of politicians, bipartisan politicians, who could push back on this and say, actually, no. That it's not about the pie is, that there's a limited amount of pie. There's pie for everybody. And in fact, we should be celebrating, right? For we are a pluralistic nation and we should be celebrating these things. Instead, what we have now is a leader who capitulates to all of these grievances that are racially coded and uses them rather than playing footsie with it, rather than playing tag with it in the dark, says, no, in fact, this is a winning strategy. This is something to encourage. And so it's become not just, a dog whistle, as everyone likes to say, it's a megaphone, right? It's a billboard in Times Square that's neon.
It's an air raid siren. Yeah.
It's an air raid siren. And I think part of what people are really struggling to come to terms with is that racial grievance politics has become, in many respects, the guiding ideology of the modern Republican Party. And in some respects, it is a winning strategy for them.
Look, it has some political traction with a lot of voters in the country, particularly, non-college educated white male voters over the age of 40. That still digs in pretty deep with those people. That still digs in this sort of weirdly misplaced sense of grievance. Because as you may have noticed, that white Christian men in this country have not had the hardest time in our 250-year history. But it does. I think you're right. It does still have a political cut. It does still have a political. There's still a sense that has a meaningful electoral consequence, and that's why it still gets adopted by a lot of Republican politicians. So I wanted to ask you something about there's a perception among Trump world, and I would say 75% of this is spin by the Republican Party and the Trump campaign, that black men are migrating to the GOP at a rapid pace, and that Hispanic men are migrating to the GOP at a rapid pace. I've seen some movement in the numbers, but it certainly doesn't strike me as a flood tide quite yet. Talk to me a little bit about where you see that developing in the political culture right now.
Okay, so the biggest thing to start with is that when we look at, for example, Black political behavior, our understanding of Black political behavior is skewed by the Obama years. The Obama years are so dramatic, dramatic, that anything on the other side of that is going to look like, spectacular. And that's in large part because, the numbers that Barack Obama gets, not just in terms of Black voter turnout, right. Black voting percentages, but in terms of turnout, right? There's a Black man on the ticket. The second that there is not a Black man on the Democratic ticket, the numbers revert back to the mean. Right? The average. So in some respects, for Republicans, and I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who was a Republican strategist working for the RNC in 2016.
Okay.
And he said, our numbers are looking at like 4%. And I go, oh gosh, are you concerned? He goes, no, anything better than 0 is a win. Right? So he's ecstatic. And I end up getting about 8% of the Black vote. And what I always tell people, what I always tell people is that is within the norm of what Republicans have gotten over the last 50, 60 years. Right. Anything that is essentially under 20% is within the normal range. When we look at the numbers of George W. Bush's second term in office, Black men, particularly Black men between the ages of 18 to 35, support George W. Bush in numbers that are really quite high. I put most of that on a figure like Armstrong Williams, who is working for the Bush administration and pours a lot of money and effort into toiling the soil for this. But I also point out, people are like, well, it drops immediately after that. Well, it drops because of Hurricane Katrina, and then it drops because Barack Obama emerges on the scene. Right. And so we have a lot of people who say, I want to be part of history. I want to be part of this. I see myself as part of this community. Now, with that said, there is a slow trickle of Black men into the Republican Party. And I want to be very careful here because the majority of Black voters, the majority of Black male voters will still vote Democratic and vote for the Democratic candidate in the 2024 election. Right. So it's not some mass exit. It is not Blexit. It is not the walk away, the walk away movement. But it does signal something that if you are a Democratic candidate, you should be paying attention to. Right. The assumption has been for the last 50, 60 some odd years that because African Americans vote for the Democratic Party in Black numbers, in large Black numbers, that in fact, everything must be hunky-dory. Everything must be fine. But that partisanship actually really obscures some significant fractures between that relationship between the Democratic Party and Black voters. It manifests, I think, most obviously in the political behaviors of Black men. And so what we see is Black men doing one of three things. Not voting. I can't vote in this election. I can't do this, right? So those numbers drop. Voting third party or registering as independent. And the third one, and this is the slow trickle, is voting for the Republican presidential candidate.
Right.
And so I think we assume that because Trump is so just out there with the bigotry, with the racism, with the xenophobia, right? This is the same guy who said my mugshot is going to win over Black male voters.
Right. What?
Because they identify with mugshots. What? That is such a deeply racist, bigoted statement.
Sure.
Right? But what I think a lot of people miss is that there have been these growing frustrations that Republican candidates have been able to take advantage of, not because they necessarily care or they're insightful. They just see it as an opportunity that they've been able to really exploit, that has and that Democrats have failed to address, that has allowed for this slow trickle of Black men into the Republican Party. And that's what we are seeing. So when we see not just a Tim Scott, but when we see someone like, Congressman Byron Donalds, right? These are examples of that very slow trickle that have a disproportionately large platform, right? We pay a lot of attention to them because they are so rare.
I think that's a really good explanation of that. And I do think, you look at the numbers between Trump in 2016 and 2020, it's 6% versus 8%. That's statistical noise. But I do think it's incumbent upon Democrats to pay attention, because there is a certain belief inside the Democratic Party that's very recursive. It's like, they're Black, therefore they vote for us. They vote for us because they're Black. And it just, it repeats over and over again. And as they have learned to great pain with Hispanic voters, particularly non-Mexican origin Hispanic voters in this country, to their great pain, they should not have the arrogance to believe that demography is destiny. They need to work on audiences that they want to keep.
Right. And one of the things that you continue to hear when you do these survey groups of African Americans who are expressing frustration or dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party and who are threatening to not vote or to vote for third-party candidates or Republican candidates, one of the things you hear over and over again is Republicans pay attention to their base, right? What do we constantly hear about? What does Trump constantly say? He says to the MAGA base, right? What do you want? I shall give it to you, right? I'll do it. I will do it. Or I will die trying. We don't hear that kind of thing from Democratic candidates in the same way. There's particularly a way that liberalism, and I think this is part of in essence, part of the ideology of liberalism, this kind of colorblind way of approaching these varied situations. So we've heard a lot about Biden and infrastructure, Biden and student loan, and the pushback from Black communities is, well, what about us? We are your most loyal base. We are the most loyal, and we hear, well, these programs apply to you too, and we care. But we see the moments that actually make a difference are twofold. One, when there are policies that are promised on the basis of this loyalty to the party. So somebody like, Biden saying, I promise you I will put a Black woman on the Supreme Court.
Right.
What happens? He puts a Black woman on the Supreme Court. That matters. The second thing is policies that affect people's day-to-day lived experiences. So when you have these policies that people feel directly affected by, that they can look out and they can touch, as opposed to some of the, the unsexy policies of, credit card bill, predatory lending and things like that. Yes, those matter, but people can't look out and touch them in a way that is really dramatic. And I would point to, one of the areas that has really become a point of contention is criminal justice reform. Black audiences have been asking for criminal justice reform for a long time. And we saw that it heated up in 2020 with the death of George Floyd. This becomes a moment that is motivating, mobilizing. We see 26, there's a movement. The movement for Black Lives touches 26 million voters in swing states. They're the difference in Georgia. They are the difference in Pennsylvania. They are the difference in Michigan. And part of what we see from that are the demands. They say, where is criminal justice reform? Where is the George Floyd Act? Where is, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? These are things that we want. Donald Trump opposes criminal justice reform for the bulk of his presidency. But then Congress passes a veto-proof majority. And what happens? Donald Trump steps in and says, I pass criminal justice reform. And that's what people remember.
It's so striking because this is like, my audience may freak out a little bit about this, but back in the mid 2000s, I did a lot of work with a whole bunch of groups that the Koch brothers were funding called Right on Crime. There was a Republican understanding that there were disproportionate outcomes in the criminal justice system, and that young black men in particular were absolutely getting railroaded, and that the legal and physical malfeasance on the part of the police was disproportionately affecting young black men. And as conservatives, they said, wait a second, if we believe in the rule of law, if we believe that the Constitution covers everyone equally, we have to live that. Now, and that kind of went away, but you're right. Trump had a sort of cunning, ability to grab onto something that he didn't believe in and pretend that he believed in it. And so I think that's a fascinating observation of why a lot of African Americans don't feel like they get the same. I mean, I'm going to use the phrase, I guess, customer service from the Democratic Party that they might get, because it is true. If you're a Republican, you take care of the base. No matter how crazy it is, you feed the crazy back to them, no matter how weird it is these days, or no matter how politically, high the mountain is, they at least pretend they're going to climb it.
Right.
So
I think there's also, just to tack onto this, the idea, there's always a political calculation going on, right? People are always doing the math. Mm-hmm. And so for whatever reason, I think Democrats have done this calculation where they say, how much will it cost us to actually say to our base, hey, we're going to do things for you. And I don't know that I don't know that Republicans do that same cost benefit analysis for their base. For their base, they say, we do this for you. You show up for us. Uh-huh. For the Democratic Party, or at least the way that Black voters perceive it, it's we show up for you, but now we don't. Now you think that doing things for us will politically cost you with these middle of the road, white centrists, independent, voters. And so we get stuck with what feels like the short end of the stick.
I get
it. And this has been a constant refrain for a very, very long time. So it's not something that's new, but it is showing up in ways, right, that essentially say people are tired. And that should be, setting off all kinds of warning bells for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think you're exactly on point there, because those warning bells, I mean, and I in 2016, when a huge influx of Puerto Rican voters had come to Florida, I'm trying to stop Trump any way I can. I talked to the Clinton people, and I'm like, what are you doing about the Puerto Rican voters in Florida? Well, we've got people on it. Don't worry. I'm like, who? And I got the Indiana Jones answer. It was like, top men. Don't worry about it. Well, they were using a firm out of Arizona to talk to Puerto Ricans in Florida. How'd that work out? Not great. But now they're shocked that fully half of those Puerto Ricans that are Democratic voters in every other respect, like, Republicans come talk to us, you guys don't, so we're voting for them. I think this is a fire the Democrats need to put out before it gets too much more out of hand.
Right.
So, I mean, look, I do think there's some of this that is Trump's campaign spinning it like, we're gonna take 35% of African Americans and all. That's insane.
That's a little bit of a stretch.
That's a world we don't live in.
Right.
So, Leah, what else are you working on lately? What else are you paying attention to? What other stories are piquing your interest right now?
Well, I think that there are a lot of stories that are going around about global democracy and about this larger kind of study of democratic regimes around the world essentially falling. But I think that there are two big things that I'm really interested in right now. The first is this idea of corruption and politics.
Sure.
And, the news cycle has made it really easy to dive into this question of corruption and politics, namely with the behavior of Supreme Court justices. And I think, we don't necessarily have an answer for the Supreme Court. It just came out the past 3 days, right, has been a buzz with not just Alito's behavior, right, but also with Clarence Thomas. And essentially his disclosures and his non-disclosures. And it has become increasingly evident that this idea of accountability, right, the accountability pledge that Chief Justice Roberts put in place last year because of Clarence Thomas's behavior, that in fact it's really not, it's not binding. It doesn't actually effectively do anything. So I've been having some interesting conversations about the both the democratic nature of the Supreme Court, but the anti-democratic nature of the Supreme Court.
Right.
And in effect, the Supreme Court is designed not to be a democratic institution, but instead is designed to be this kind of stalwart that upholds these various, guideposts and guidelines.
Right.
And so what happens when corruption infiltrates the Supreme Court? In the past, what it's been is the Supreme Court justices take themselves out of consideration, right? They say the responsible thing for me,
to participate in this case. Yeah.
It is different now. It is radically different now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's becoming apparent that the Supreme Court, which used to, I think, during the 70s and 80s, really pride itself on being objective, being nonpartisan, being apolitical in many ways, has essentially thrown this away and said, what are you going to do? Right? To quote the Real Housewives, who's going to check me, boo? No one. And that's what we know. Now that's what I think we're finding out. No one is. And I think that is one of the real stories, particularly as all of these decisions are both coming down the pipeline. But increasingly, as Supreme Court justices are stepping out and saying, you know what? Who cares? That has real implications for how we understand democracy, but it also has real implications for how we understand presidential elections and even questions of race, of class, of gender, all of these things.
Sure.
And then, the other thing that has completely preoccupied me is this question of what happens when you put a convicted felon on the ballot.
Yep.
Essentially, we are, I'm a historian by training. We're in uncharted territories. And yes, on the one hand, the founders actually envisioned a figure like Trump, right? They
did.
They had anyone, if you have questions about scandal and corruption and porn stars and things like that, I encourage you to go see Hamilton or read the book. But I think, they put all of these things in places. What they couldn't have envisioned is a nation that is not necessarily enamored with ideas of democracy. And therefore, the guideposts and the guidelines that they've put in place are vague enough and vary enough dramatically, so much so that this is what we're going to have. We may have a convicted felon who is president of the United States, while ironically, opposing the idea of felons having the right to vote.
Right.
So I want to see how this plays out. And I also think that the other big narrative that a lot of people just didn't believe until January 6th, even though the signs were there, which is about violence within the United States and the way, and I think the ways in which violence, which is American as apple pie, right, has essentially come home to roost.
Yeah.
And that the reality is that whatever the outcome of the 2024 election, there is a very, very good chance that violence will be a part of it. And I don't know that America has come to terms with that. I am deeply shocked and actually horrified by the ways how people have erased January 6th or whitewashed it or downplayed it. Right? There was a gallows on the Capitol steps. Several people died that day. People came with zip ties and guns, ready to do what was necessary to ensure that their version, right, of political legitimacy was enacted. So, I think we are, in some essence, we are removed, but we've also shown that there has been very little political consequence to the powers that be for encouraging this anti-democratic, illiberal violence in our country at its most sacred spots. And so when you have that kind of thing, we should anticipate that it will happen again, particularly given that the former president of the United States, even as he has been convicted of crimes, has essentially emerged relatively unscathed from participating, engaging, and abetting in an attempted overthrow of an American democratic institutions.
I could not have put it better myself, Leah. I mean, that this is the real question: are we ready to break? We've already broken it to a degree, but are we ready to break the 250-year chain of slow, plodding progress toward being the America that the design specification wasn't perfect in the beginning, but to being the America we're supposed to be, which is a republic based on democratic principles and representation and free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power? Because there are a lot of people who would accept an alternative to that. These guys who are obsessed with Trump being the Red Caesar, or that we need just an authoritarian for a little while to take care of some business. All that, to my mind, is crazy talk. But I think it's more present in the culture and our society and our politics than people want to admit. So with that, Leah, I want to thank you so much for coming on The Enemies List today. You are absolutely brilliant and a delight to talk to. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Oh,
Absolutely.
anytime.
All right.